Good morning. A week has passed since my first lecture, and I hope you haven't forgotten, or in the event some of you have come for the first time, I'm going to remind you that my name is Krikorian, and I pointed out that the last part, IAN, refers to son of or descended from. In Armenian, it would be Krikorian, which means descended from Gregory or Krikor. This is analogous, as I also pointed out, to the Mick in Irish, which means son of, Mac in Scottish, bin in Arabic, like bin Laden, about whom you've heard a lot, or Ben Gurion, as in Hebrew, etc. Now, I won't recapitulate too much, but I will take the trouble to emphasize that it was important for me to set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, because without background, it doesn't do any good to talk about what has come to be called the Armenian Genocide. We emphasize that, in point of fact, that there was a precedent to the genocide in the form of overall oppression and suppression in the Ottoman Empire of the subject races. Now, these races were organized, I also pointed out, in so-called millets, a title that usually meant a nation, in quotes, sort of, where the Greeks constituted one millet, the Armenians yet another millet, the Jews, or Hebrews as they referred to, as yet another millet, and ultimately by the mid-19th century, in the 1800s, there was in fact, as a result of the activities of the missionaries, an entitlement of the Protestant millet. It was considerably smaller. But in any case, these people constituted what was referred to by the Turks as a raya, and the raya has come to be a little bit argued in the sense that some have said, those who espouse the Turkish point of view, that the raya constituted the flock, a little bit like the flock as it was looked after by Jesus, and referring to the Christians. Well, some of the missionaries used to say, well, the Turks call the Armenians, for example, raya. What they mean is flock, that is to be the flock that was kept to be fleeced. These people were taken advantage of economically. We pointed out that the Armenians were relatively few in number compared to the entire empire, but that was due to emigration, migration, and movement, but they still constituted probably around 2 million people, constituting without any devotional separation, as they say. That means the Roman Catholic Armenians, the Protestant Armenians, and the vast majority belonging to the national church, which is the so-called Apostolic Church. These are the ancient churches of the East that were regarded by many of the missionaries as somewhat corrupt, or the lesser churches that didn't quite meet their interpretation of what the Protestant Christianity should be. Now, so now you've got a situation where there are Armenians initially in an old part of the empire that was in Eastern Asia Minor, Western Asia, more latterly referred to as Anadolu, which is a little bit inaccurate, but it's not the first inaccuracy that's come to be the reality. We also emphasize that the sultans lived fairly high off the hog and spent money they didn't have, sort of a familiar situation. And probably the most profligate spender was the Red Sultan, the Bloody Sultan, as he was referred to as Abdul Hamid II. Abdul Hamid was in many cases referred to as the symbol of the sick man of Europe. Turkey became referred to as the sick man because it really had a lot of difficulties, but I might also add quickly that the sick man ended up showing that it wasn't ready to expire yet. Sultan Hamid kept the empire intact by manipulating the European powers, the concert of Europe, as it was frequently referred to, by balancing one against the other, playing one against the other, and taking full advantage of the jealousies that they existed. I also pointed out that the Germans, in the form of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had connections with Britain and Russia, Queen Victoria was his maternal grandmother. His mother was the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria. His cousin Nicky was the Tsar of the Russias, and so on. So all of these royal houses were fairly interbred, and I'm not going to worry about genealogy, but if you look at these things, you wonder who was actually not related to one another. Now, the massacres of the 1890s were pretty serious. There are a lot of Armenians who were rendered more poor than normal. I said that there tended to be a little bit of mercy towards women, not always, but tended towards, even as men were massacred. But the onslaught against women was indirect, nevertheless real. Without a breadwinner, families fell into absolute poverty. The missionaries of Europe, for instance, the Swiss and the English, and even the Germans, did a little bit to help at that time. Probably the Swiss shelled out more, the Danes, of course. A lot of these people, interestingly enough, along with the Americans, who had been there longer, set up infrastructure, as we would now call it, to deliver aid to people who were suffering from whatever deprivation, whether brought about by massacre or whatever. I also drew attention to the fact that Clara Barton of our American Red Cross made a trip to the Ottoman Empire to give help to the Armenians that were survivors of the Hamidian massacres. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was not very anxious to let this happen, but ultimately, through persistence and pressure, she was let in, and there's a fair amount of documentation on that. I've talked about the archives and a lot of information in those archives, not only in America, but all over the place. France, Germany, what all. Your reference list, incidentally, if there's anyone here who did not get a list of references, can pick one up. These have been carefully selected from the perspective that many people can gain access without even going to a library. You can do it online. Now, the note on which I finished last time, if I remember correctly, was that the things could have been different if the reforms that had been intended for the provinces in the east that the Armenians inhabited predominantly had in fact come into play. The idea was to take the 6 or 7 provinces called vilayets and break them into 2 and put in charge of each of them a European. In this case, one was going to be a Norwegian, the other one was a Dutchman. They were all set to take over, but the war broke out. In this issue of the journal called the Armenian Review, which was American language, English language, in 1986, this is dedicated to covering huge amounts of information on the so-called less than ink file, which is a tremendous documentation of the diaries of the Dutch fellow was going to move into the eastern area. It never came to pass because the war had broken out. Now, the breaking out of the war is kind of interesting in that people can talk about this business of total war. World War I was the first of the total war. The expression of all's fair in love and war is kind of something that we've all heard about. It really means that the total war aspect was pretty severe and violent. The old gentlemanly rules of waging war kind of went out the window. And some of you have even watched the most recent series on Downton Abbey will remember some of the horrible war scenes in the trenches of France on the Somme and so forth, where it was pretty a vicious idea. Now, the bottom line is that we can always say that it might have been, you've heard the old poetic rendition of the saddest words of tongue or pen, it might have been. Well, the fact is that there are a couple of things. Some of you may have heard of Gallipoli. There's a Mel Gibson movie called Gallipoli. It's a pretty good movie. There are books been written on it, and this is tied with the English invasion, the British invasion of the Turkish Empire in the area of the Straits that I showed you on a map last time, with the idea of knocking Turkey out of the war early. People try to make the argument that, well, Turkey really didn't want to enter the war on the side of the Germans. Well, that may or may not be arguable. I certainly take the view is that they willingly entered on the side of Germany. Some have suggested that there's evidence, I haven't seen it, that Germany paid money to Enver Pasha, who was the Minister of War, to force the entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war on the side of the Germans. The certain idea that Turks very much appreciated German efficiency, plus this business of loans, lots of money being loaned to the Ottomans. But the fact is that Gallipoli was a debacle. Some of you know that much. It was a total fiasco. The Turks drove out the British, which was largely formed by the gallant fighting of the Australians and the New Zealanders. And we mentioned the 24th of April being the commemorative day for the Armenian Genocide. Well, the day after, his 25th day, is Anzac Day. So if you're ever in Australia on the Anzac Day, you will see that we can't really call it a celebration, it's a commemoration. Massive numbers of Australians died at Gallipoli and New Zealanders. And the story goes that in that period, a lot of Australian and New Zealand women ended up unmarried because there were no men to go around. Very few. Tremendous impact on the psyche, even now, of the Australians and the New Zealanders. We talked about ethnic identity and so forth. This is a period where the area in Turkey, it's even given the name Anzac Cove, but bad decisions were made, very bad from the beginning, and guess who made these decisions? None other than Winston Churchill, who's revered for his role in saving the world and Britain during the Nazi period. He was Minister of the Lord of the Admiralty, the Navy. And they just botched it up because they thought it was going to be a piece of cake, and they underestimated the Turks. And here's what I've read. I don't pretend to be an expert on any of this. The Gallipoli, they say that if the Brits had hung in there just a very short period longer, they would have won. The Turks were absolutely very close to running out of ammunition, and they would have capitulated. So here you have this business of Gallipoli giving the Turks a new breath. In other words, they proved to themselves that, look, we can fight these people and we can win, and we're not going to be subservient to any of these Europeans any longer. At the same time, in addition to this huge amount of literature, there's even more than a few videos. This DVD is called All the King's Men. The true story of England's vanished regiment is revealed, put on by Masterpiece Theatre, and it's well acted. Dame Maggie Smith, who we all know and generally appreciate as an actress, is in it. And this is telling you about a very personal story of an entire regiment that was lost, and the take-home lesson is that they were done in by the Turks. Take no prisoners. Although the other side of the story is, to be fair and balanced, to quote our well-known news program, the Turks were admired by many. In fact, the man who became Kemal Ataturk, the father of his country, handled the Turkish army at that time, and he said, I want you, yours is to do or die. Don't do anything else. And he rallied the troops around, and they won. Now, there are other things that we can talk about at the same time to just broaden the story a bit. Many have heard of Lawrence of Arabia and the Arab Revolt. Remember, I pointed out that Arabia was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman province of Arabia. Now, that was considered by many an absolute miracle when Aqaba, where the guns were facing one way out to the sea, was taken from the back by Lawrence and his, quote, various tribes who didn't even then quite identify with being Arabs. They were all tribal. But Lawrence of Arabia played a major role. He was much disappointed afterwards on how his, quote, Arabs were treated by Britain, but that's another dimension. So this is a film that was made that's quite excellent, Lawrence of Arabia. And I might also point out that it won't hurt students to know about this thing called Saudi Aramco World. This is put out every 2 months. It's beautiful in terms of color illustrations. It's well written and beautifully edited. And it gives you an idea of a little bit about Islamic Muslim cultures, historic articles, many of them written by Westerners, but plenty by people with Arab roots, etc. There's one little article in the most current one, which is kind of fun, in that there's a picture of Mehmed IV. And you'll say, oh, I remember hearing him talking about Mehmed V, who is the sultan that replaced the unseated Sultan Abdul Hamid. So we've got another dimension here, and I just want to use this opportunity to emphasize that everything's interconnected. When students see things, they usually tend to want it clean, simple, tell me what I have to know for the exam. That's not the way life is, that's not the way these stories go, and it's certainly not the way to envision what took place during World War I, during what's come to be called the Armenian Genocide. Now, that's enough background for the time being. Let's get into a few facts. Number one, the Armenian Genocide. And you say, well, how can you talk about something as a genocide when the word wasn't even produced by Lemkin until considerably later. Yeah, here I'm talking about like the early 40s. Now, the concept admittedly was correct, but it didn't hit print till quite a lot later. So here we are, we've got this word genocide, and many questions have been asked. Was it a genocide? And I have said yes. And we'll see a little bit more as I talk today, more and more of why we believe that is the case. In fact, I'll even go one step further. Anyone who knows anything will have to admit that what transpired during that period of so-called total war was in fact a genocide. Now, calling things by a name is, I should say, important because we have to use the right name for certain things. And if we don't call things by their right name, then you end up with problems. Now, in the case of genocide, there's a genocide convention about which you've been told some things. I've given full references on the handout. But the genocide convention points out that it's a crime. And if something is a crime, you can be taken before the law courts on this. You start using other words, such as catastrophe. What's a catastrophe? I mean, Hurricane Sandy was a catastrophe. That doesn't mean you take someone to court. Okay, I won't work that over too much, but that is one of the things that you have to come to grips with, because now in that early period, from the 1870 and earlier, much earlier, people have been doing massacres forever. The massacre of the innocents, etc. Okay, this business of Passover that the Jews commemorate very soon. Massacres are in the World Library catalogs. And there are some people who we happen to know one who's a very fine fellow. He's a retired librarian. His name is Sanford Berman. Sandy Berman is retired as the head cataloger for the Hennepin County, Minneapolis-St. Paul library system. And he's considered one of the most activist librarians around. And his view has been to start updating cataloging to meet the reality and to come up to date. He's written a note, 2010, and I might say this is not the only note. He just does this again and again and again, and then he'll get some results. On 3/4/10, the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs passed House Resolution 252, affirmation of the United States record on the Armenian Genocide resolution, which he has attached. For all the reasons stated in the 30, quote, findings, end quote, I urge the Library of Congress to join the worldwide community of scholars, legislators, and human rights advocates by finally replacing the denial-laden subject heading Armenian massacres with the more accurate and honest Armenian genocide. Well, so far that hasn't happened. He's gotten all kinds of responses from the higher mucky-mucks, and I asked Sandy, I said, how much of a job would it be to change it? He said, it's a matter of seconds. It was a couple of clicks of the computer and it would all be changed. Well, again, massacres is pretty bad, but you know, last year in Scotland came across a very nice monument of some massacres that took place in Scotland in the 1600s. Well, it's something like 40 people. Well, if you're one of the 40 that are relatives of the 40, that's one story. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So at what point can one use the argument, well, it was only a massacre? Now, there's some literature on this which is kind of significant, I think, in that Victor Hugo, the great French writer, said something to the following effect. In Paris, if someone is murdered, it's called a murder and a crime. If thousands are murdered in the East, and he was talking about the East, it's called a question. Now, the Eastern question is encountered in library headings, the Armenian question, all kinds of questions. There's even a Turkish question later. But it's an amusing thing in that these questions were a mealy-mouthed way, in my view, of labeling things obtusely so that you didn't have to face it. Everyone could have his viewpoint. You could get up and pontificate if it helped you politically. Or you could address it in a meaningful way, which no one wanted to do. But the Armenian question that arose out of the Treaty of Berlin following the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and its settlement at San Stefano, time number one, and then renegotiated at Berlin in 1878, the Armenian question got watered down. I pointed that out last time. Okay, now, so here we have this situation where you've got large numbers of civilians. Now, I didn't emphasize last time, and I want to bring it to the fore now, that as part of being a millet and a raya, whether you would have fleeced or not, meant that you could not bear arms. Non-Muslims did not bear arms in the Ottoman Empire. You paid instead a tax that exempted you. And the tax wasn't minor. It wasn't just a tiny little poll tax. It was a substantial tax. But you paid it, you didn't have to serve. And I wouldn't even say I put it the proper way there. You wouldn't have to serve. You paid the tax instead of serving. Now, by the time the Turk Revolution, the Young Turk Revolution, and the Young Turks came into power, after unseating Sultan Abdul Hamid and putting his brother in place, Christians could, in fact, bear arms. They said, okay, this part of this new system where we're all brothers and sisters and all equal in the eyes of the law, etc., etc., you will, in fact, serve in the army. People say, oh, that's great, you know. So the taxation then was that you could still not serve, but you paid a tax, which was still higher. It would have translated to several $100 in money even then. And in any case, you had a quasi-armed Armenian population. They weren't just using old hunting rifles. Some of them had a little bit better. But that didn't help much because people really inside of Turkey didn't fully see the writing on the wall. Some did, but they couldn't really believe that the goose that laid the golden egg for the Kurds and the Turks were going to be done in. But that's quite happening. It's a little bit like the movie on the Holocaust where at the Ship of Fools, and they said, well, they can't kill all of us, can they? Well, they could, and they did in many cases. So, what kind of evidence do we have? Newspaper accounts. Well, those who would say the newspaper accounts represented what came to be called, even then, yellow journalism. you couldn't believe the newspaper accounts because it was all cooked up to sell newspapers. They wrote articles that had no substance, some of which was true, but most of wasn't. In fact, the head of the libraries at University of California, Berkeley, has written a wonderful chapter on the validity and accuracy of the press reports at that time as it refers to the Armenian Genocide. Pretty good job for a press that had its problems. And I might also point out, as you know, the American press isn't so wonderful now either. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so hysterical over WikiLeaks and the like. Now, I mentioned April 24th, the day the intellectuals of Constantinople were arrested without notice, taken off, eventually to be murdered. Couple survived, by the way. Here's an interesting work that was translated from Armenian called, it's a biography of a fellow who was an encyclopedist, but Monument to April 11. You say, well, now, why is this called April 11? Here he is talking about April 24th. Well, in the period in question, what they used to call the Julian, well, still do, what they used to call the Roman calendar, or the Rumi calendar, or that was set up Pope Julius, called the Julian. We use the so-called Krikorian calendar now, and there is in fact an 11-day difference. So 13-day, I guess. I ought to learn how to count here. So 13 days, it's 11 April by the calendar of that day and age, and the 24th now. Now, so people did keep notes, and they're smuggled out, and a few survived, but the survivor, yet another one. Some of these people ultimately will see the fatal night. There's a huge pile of literature, some of which is starting to see the light of day in English. This is one of the drawbacks. A lot of the period literature is in Armenian, and whatever was happening. Now I'm going to just skip ahead for 1 second. Turkey said, after this battle that I told you about, where the Turkish army was nearly totally wiped out in the Caucasus, and Enver Pasha was looking for an excuse with Talat to come up with a method. They said, oh, well, these Armenians were going to be a fifth column. We couldn't trust these sons of guns, and we've got to move them out of the war zone. Well, they moved them out of the war zone, all right, but they moved them out of everywhere else. And the method of moving took on a number of names. In the first instance, and we're translating all of these names, incidentally, obviously they're not in English, are a relocation, deportation, exile, forced exile. Okay? Now, let's break this down a little bit. That makes it sound as the flock is being nicely looked after. All we're going to do is take you out of harm's way. We're going to take you out of the way where you won't be tempted to help the enemy. Well, it's no harm in thinking. It's absolutely not true. Because the first thing that happened in that entire early period, after the arrest of those intellectuals and potential leaders of any resistance in Constantinople, the same thing was going on in various larger towns. They weren't big cities as we know them now. They weren't Chicago or Philadelphia or LA or New York. But the point was that the leadership, even in these communities, the clergy, the so-called aghas, who were upper crust notables, these people were arrested and taken away and murdered. A lot of the younger fighting age people were nominally drafted to be taken into the army, and in many cases they were moved into remote areas, they were forced to dig their own graves, and they were murdered. Others were, in fact, given the option of not being deported or exiled if they converted to Islam. Become a Muslim and you'll be okay. Well, some did that. Very few, but they did. Most didn't, and they suffered. You could be in various professions which were much needed at that time, and you could buy time, as it were, for a while. For instance, if you were a physician, well, the Turkish army or the Turkish military needed people to look after them health-wise. If you were a lamp maker, kerosene lamps were widely used because there was no electricity in many places. So as someone who could make lamps, or if you were a very good tailor, you could make army uniforms for the officers. Bakers, if you were a baker, you could bake bread for the army. That could buy you a little bit of time. So everyone did not get collected, relocated, killed under the guise of getting rid of the fifth column. But many ended up being relocated, and what relocated meant, we're going to see in a moment. The first slide I'm going to show you is of some interest because it'll show you on a bigger scale than the ones I showed last time of the sphere of German influence during World War I. And I might also point out that there are those who believe that Turkey got the idea of doing all of this from the Germans. Now, the Germans don't like that, and I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that that argument has been put forward. And the Turks have even put it forward. Well, they put us up to it. They made us do it. If we can zoom in on this, it'll be a little bit bigger. Peoples awaiting deliverance. There were nearly 50 million people in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey who were subject races before the Great War broke out. It was the plan of the Prussian Junkers who controlled Prussia, which controlled Germany, to make Germany control its allies and the whole alliance control the world. The control of the subject races, shown above, with the destruction of Serbia as a nation, is the key to the whole plan. With the 50 millions once delivered into freedom, the world is freed from them, from the German menace. Now, this is a little bit propagandistic, but you see with all of the black areas, this reddish, not, I guess it's orange, that's what came to be Czechoslovakia, but all of these are ethnic groups. This is your Anatolia, there's your Armenia, this is your Arabia. You see, it's pretty impressive. It's a pretty big sphere of influence on the part of Germany. Now, the next slide will draw better attention to massacres and deportations of the Armenians in 1915. You can see that's in very excellent King's English. It happens to be a French map made by a French Armenian. It was the first attempt to draw attention number one, this is Armenian Rus, meaning Russian Armenia. This is the Turkish, Kurdistan, Mesopotamia, Syria. This is the Mediterranean. Here's your Adana, where the 1909 massacres took place. And here's your Black Sea and your Caspian Sea, Georgia. Now, early on, and the material has been found, orders for deporting the Armenians from the empire to the south was actually brought into being. They're a little bit sloppy in enacting all of this, but for the most part, in the eastern areas, in early July, the Armenians were moved out with very short notice, told that they need not take very much with them, and they were going to be moved down, and they could rebuild and start their lives anew, fresh start. Well, anyone who knew anything about that area knew that this area of Syria was a barren desert. It wasn't the kind of what I call a Lawrence of Arabia desert. It was more stony, nevertheless still very arid, very rough walking. People were not allowed to have water if it was available. Their food still early ran out. They were forced to buy water when they could at exorbitant prices, like $20 a cup of water. Women in particular would swallow gold pieces so that the money would still be available. And of course, the idea was to wait around until this passed through the intestinal system so you could collect the gold that way. All along the deportation routes, and these circles represent the actual rough numbers, driven to the areas, the worst part was Deir Zor, which still exists, and if you listen to the news these days, with all of the problems going on in Syria, even Deir Zor has been mentioned on Amy Goodman in her Democracy Now! Program. Aleppo, you've heard Aleppo in the news as well. This area here was a stopping place where the refugees who survived, because many were dying along the way, could find a tiny bit of respite. They weren't treated so horrendously horrible there for a tiny bit of time until the Turks got their acts together again and shipped them out to the east where the final killing fields were going to be. If you survived this far and weren't dead, we'll move you out a little bit more towards Urfa. This is the old city of Edessa where the prophet Abraham was supposedly born. And all in all, the technique of deportation took on, very early, the idea of deliberate extermination. Now, I've never liked the word extermination because it sounds like you're doing it in cockroaches instead of people, but that was the word that was being used. And even in the German press at that time, in the German literature, one talks about Vernichtung, or what I translate as be-nothing, or doing people in, exterminating them, is in fact. So you killed a lot of men directly under the guise that they were being dragged for the army. Many were put into work battalions and worked to death because they were under horrible conditions. They took the place of animals to carry arms, etc. Those who could escape did. Those who converted could do for a while. Some were hidden, some hid themselves. As caravans moved down, young girls and women, if they happened to be good enough looking, got abducted, taken into harems. Now, many people, again, have the idea of a harem of something they've seen in Hollywood where everyone's just lounging around. Well, that's not quite the way it was around here. It's just that you had households with a lot of servants, young girls, etc. Women who were in some cases treated all right, in many cases really badly treated and molested. Some women at that time and young girls were tattooed to make them nominally pass as Turks. Now you get this bit of transferal of identity. The young kids, of course, could frequently not remember anything. They weren't sure who they were. As their parents died, households were wiped out from death and famine. They saved bullets, basically. But all along the way, there were also real massacres carried out by the riffraff who had been let out of prison. These killing battalions were let out of jail because the military didn't want to do it, and they were too busy fighting their own wars in that war zone. So you've got people being done in by a complicit public. Now, some people claim that, look, no Armenian would be alive if it hadn't been for the kindness of some Turk or Kurd. And that can be true. It is true. In my own mother's case, she was taken in by the Kurds. Now, down in this neck of the woods, okay. Now, the bottom line is that the word deportation, people say, well, that was used for the Armenians. It wasn't. It was also used with the Jews. When the Allies opened the gates, you can see here, this is a very excellent rundown by Olga Lemsa-Mijo. Second edition, The Return of the Deportees. The deportees, those of you who know anything about the Jewish Holocaust other than from Schindler's List, will know that one of the first stages was to be deported. Where'd you get deported to? Well, you got deported to Auschwitz, etc. We've been watching this series called Shoah, which is in fact another way of the catastrophe. They ought to really emphasize that that's a crime too. These are interviews with some people who survived. They've gone back to the areas where all of these atrocities occurred during the Nazi genocide against the Jews, the Gypsies, all kinds of people. Okay, now, the next slide, if we can have the next one, please. This here is the, go back one. Yeah, this is in Armenian. This is called the Abrilian Yelegni. This is the April. Now, this word here, Yelegni, is a very complicated word. And the dictionary specialists have said, how are we going to translate that? It means something to the equivalent of catastrophe. And I think that I'm just emphasizing here is that terminology in all of this business evolves. The next slide. Remember, the Jewish Holocaust was not the first Holocaust. They converted that gradually and took over the word Holocaust. The burning of Smyrna in Asia Minor, right here in 1922, by the Turks as a final act of getting rid of the Greeks from the Ottoman Empire, was in fact listed at that time and described as a Holocaust. The direction of the deportations, now some of the earlier maps, interestingly enough, showed people moving this way. Well, as it turns out, the Italian consul described boatloads of Armenian kids and adults being taken out into the Black Sea and dumped. They were drowned. I don't mean to snicker, but you see, again, these kinds of things hardly seem like relocation to get you out of the way and for us to protect you, our beneficence. There's immense amounts of information, and the literature is starting to take a new form. In that early period, a description, the treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. This is the so-called Blue Book. It's not terribly blue here, but it's faded. This was commissioned by Viscount Grey of Faladon, and it was pushed by Viscount Bryce, who had been the British ambassador to America, a man of great integrity, much appreciated. The details of what was going on at that time are horrendous, and you can read them in here, and they're online as outlined in the handout. The report at that time did not give the names of the witnesses. They were afraid that if they were listed, that they wouldn't be able to render what little help they could to survivors. The names were available, they just weren't published then. They were published as a separate book. This has come out a number of times, and in recent years it's even been translated into Turkish and given to Turkish legislators, and the idea is that we'll start getting the word out. How much good it'll do is another matter. Okay, now, this period is not terribly well documented visually because it was against the law to take photographs. This is an important picture, though, in that even though it's not terribly clear here, if you analyze it, as we have, this represents Armenians being arrested and taken off under armed guard, never to be seen again. They're going off first to jail and then taken out and murdered. Now, this was taken in 1915, probably very early June or July, taken from the upper story of the American consulate, the place where Leslie Amerton Davis resided, the fellow who I mentioned last time from Port Jefferson, New York, the Slaughterhouse Province. Can you see that? Okay, now, the next slide. That same, nearly 1 million genocide victims from the New York Times International, covered in a cloak of amnesia. Well, the Turks, in fact, may have amnesia, but as I say frequently, you have to know something in order to forget it. So you're not going to have amnesia on something that you don't know. And many, many Turks now do not know about what their ancestors did. And if you don't know, you're not going to treat it as a very important thing. Next slide, please. Now, this picture you see here, now, this here is the Danish book that uses that same image, but the Danes were neutral at that time in World War I. There's a very substantial information in Danish that's being translated gradually into English. And the Swedes have a literature, the Norwegians, above and beyond the German records, which are all being translated into English and are on the website that we've again pointed out in our list. The next slide will show you that one of the horrible things that one talks about in this period, but nevertheless is well documented, is this. The American outreach towards survivors of that horrible period really came to the fore in 1919, and I'm going to quickly go through these, and then I'm going to put the lights back on, and we'll finish up in a minute. Next slide. Little kids who had been separated from their parents or whose parents died or were killed were living like animals best they could, and ultimately, when opportunities permitted in Russian Armenia, to collect these kids and look at the skin and bones. Here's a kid that clearly has a case of bad, you see, that is kind of a form of tuberculosis where the bones are affected. Horrible. And you can see the clothing here is an absolute mess. Rags. Next slide. Look at, and then, a little kid's skin and bones. These kinds of pictures were circulated in the attempt to get people to feel as though they'd try to give some help. Give clothing, money, whatever. Next. Next slide. Little kids, these probably are brother and brother. Again, barefoot, trying to survive in a very difficult period. The descriptions of what was going on at that time were absolutely horrendous. Next. At the seat of the Armenian Church in Etchmiadzin, now outside of the capital city of Yerevan in Armenia, the Catholicos, or the head of the Armenian Church, opened up the entire area to orphans and orphanages, above and beyond those that were set up by foreigners, about which I'm going to tell you more in a minute. But you see these head coverings? Those aren't part of a costume. Favus, F-A-V-U-S, was a fungal problem that a lot of these kids caught from being out under horrendous conditions. Favus was treatable, but with really quite extreme conditions. They used to almost put gasoline on the kids, kerosene, and treat it with sulfur. If you were lucky, you could get rid of it. Next slide. This stamp buys a meal for a starving Armenian child. Near East relief. And many older people say that they remember as kids being told by their parents, eat your dinner, clean your plate, remember the starving Armenians. Next slide, please. Cartoonists participated. When a lot of fellers need a lot of friends, here's these kids by the gazillion. Briggs was a very well-known cartoonist. Near East relief, banging on the door, U.S. up here. So I'll put the lights on for a moment and divert our attention to a couple of things. Now, number one, I'm going to take just a few minutes because this can go on and on. Number one, all these kinds of things are well documented. Big fat book, The Armenian Genocide by Raymond Krikorian, who's in Paris, and he has been the head of a well-known Armenian library in the city. The Nubadian Library, as it's called. This came out first in French, and this is the English version. The father of Armenian genocide studies in English is an unusual fellow who was on the faculty of SUNY Geneseo, named Vahakan Dadrian. He was born in Istanbul, Turkey. He has degrees from Vienna and the University of Chicago. A mathematician and a sociologist and a pioneer in modern Armenian genocide studies. A fellow who he's taken interest in as a student of sorts is a man named Taner Akçam, who is from Turkey, suffered a great deal because of his activism, jailed actually, who's now a professor in Worcester, Massachusetts at Clark University. He's a named chair for Armenian Genocide Studies, a shameful act. So there's more than a tiny literature on all of this. And the point that should be made is there are a couple of happy incidents as well. One is, there's a story of Musa Dag. Musa Dag was the mountain, Mount Moses, where the Armenians made the decision that they were not going to follow the order for deportation. They put up a resistance, and they were able to fend themselves for some 50 plus days, which became translated by an Austrian Jew named Franz Werfel. Franz Werfel wrote a book called The 40 Days of Musa Dag. This novel, which was big and thick, published first in German, translated into many languages, was very widely read. In fact, it was even read in the ghettos in Warsaw and in all kinds of environments where the Jews were trying to put up resistance, because the inspiration from Musa Dag kind of showed them, look, you can do a little bit if you have to. Well, as it turned out, they were rescued by some French ships and taken to Port Said, Egypt. It's the very, very, very few happy instances of the Armenian Genocide where some people were survivors. Okay, only 4,000 or 5,000 people at most. The book that I held up first, though, is of considerable interest. The movie rights to 40 Days, as it's referred to, the 40 Days of Musa Dag, 40 Days of Musa Dag was going to be made into a movie. And the Turks became ballistic and succeeded in having Hollywood back off under United States State Department pressure to not have the movie played. They put out a rather poor version of it quite a few years later. It's had a long history, and some of it is documented in here. This is a translation from of the survivors. So on that particular note, we'll sort of now move briefly to finish up one thing and then pick up next time. The idea that there was in place in Turkey and in Syria missionaries who had been trying to educate and bring Western standards were on site. They didn't need the American Red Cross, as they did with Clara Barton, to render help. These people were already there, and it seemed very reasonable that any help should be given to them through the missionaries and what was initially called the Armenian Atrocities Committee, the Armenian and Syrian Massacres Committee, the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, which evolved into the Near East Relief and still functions since 1930 as the Near East Foundation. Raising money for the starving Armenians and other people in what was referred to as Bible lands was achieved by every way possible. First of all, some very rich Americans undertook what we would now call the underwriting of the indirect costs, the overhead, so that everything that was raised directly went to survivors. This here is a movie that was called Ravished Armenia, the story of a real survivor, Aurora Mardiganian. It cost $10 to see the film, which translates to about $134 in today's money, given inflation. So you can see that it was not an inexpensive movie, but she would frequently be shown. They'd parade her out. She acted in the movie herself. She had no experience, and it's a quite dramatic poster in terms of that. Now, so the Near East Relief, about whom I'll tell more. The story of the Near East Relief was published, I guess, in 1930 by a man who was the secretary of the American Board. Remember I mentioned the ABC-FM in Boston? Story of the Near East Relief, 1915-1930, by James L. Barton. Barton was a Protestant minister who turned out to be a real statesman, but also somewhat problematic, in my opinion, for the following reason, and this will be a note on which to end. He actually thought that when World War I ended, new opportunities for Christian missionaries would be open in the Ottoman Empire. You talk about having blind faith, it went nowhere. So we'll pick up next time on a little bit more of this, and then get into the impunity, which is the central theme of this seminar. Were organized, I also pointed out, in so-called millets. A title that usually meant a nation, in quotes, sort of, where the Greeks constituted one millet, the Armenians yet another millet, the Jews, or Hebrews as they referred to, as yet another millet. And ultimately, by the mid-19th century, in the 1800s, there was, in fact, as a result of the activities of the missionaries, an entitlement of the Protestant millet. It was considerably smaller. But in any case, these people constituted what was referred to by the Turks as a raya, and the raya has come to be a little bit argued in the sense that some have said, those who espouse the Turkish point of view, that the raya constituted the flock, a little bit like the flock as it was looked after by Jesus, and referring to the Christians. Well, some of the missionaries used to say, well, the Turks call the Armenians, for example, raya. What they mean is flock, that is to be the flock that was kept to be fleeced. These people were taken advantage of economically. We pointed out that the Armenians were relatively few in number compared to the entire empire, but that was due to Good morning. A week has passed since my first lecture, and I hope you haven't forgotten, or in the event some of you have come for the first time, I'm going to remind you that my name is Krikorian, and I pointed out that the last part, IAN, refers to son of or descended from. In Armenian, it would be Krikorian, which means descended from Gregory or Krikor. This is analogous, as I also pointed out, to the Mick in Irish, which means son of, Mac in Scottish, bin in Arabic, like bin Laden, about whom you've heard a lot, or Ben Gurion, as in Hebrew, etc. Now, I won't recapitulate too much, but I will take the trouble to emphasize that it was important for me to set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, because without background, it doesn't do any good to talk about what has come to be called the Armenian Genocide. We emphasize that, in point of fact, that there was a precedent to the genocide in the form of overall oppression and suppression in the Ottoman Empire of the subject races. Now, these races, Sultan Hamid kept the empire intact by manipulating the European powers, the concert of Europe, as it was frequently referred to, by balancing one against the other, playing one against the other, and taking full advantage of the jealousies that they existed. I also pointed out that the Germans, in the form of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had connections with Britain and Russia. Queen Victoria was his maternal grandmother. His mother was the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria. His cousin Nicky was the Tsar of the Russias, and so on. So all of these royal houses were fairly interbred, and I'm not going to worry about genealogy, but if you look at these things, you wonder who was actually not related to one another. Now, the massacres of the 1890s were pretty serious. There are a lot of Armenians who were rendered more poor than normal. I said that there tended to be a little bit of mercy towards women, not always, but tended towards, even as men were massacred. But the onslaught against women was indirect, nevertheless real. Without a breadwinner, families fell into absolute poverty. The missionaries of Europe, for instance, the Swiss and the English, and even the Germans, did a little bit to help at that time. Probably the Swiss shelled out more, the Danes, of course. A lot of these people, interestingly enough, along with the Americans, who had been there longer, set up immigration, migration, and movement, but they still constituted probably around 2 million people, constituting without any devotional separation, as they say. That means the Roman Catholic Armenians, the Protestant Armenians, and the vast majority belonging to the national church, which is the so-called Apostolic Church. These are the ancient churches of the East that were regarded by many of the missionaries as somewhat corrupt, or the lesser churches that didn't quite meet their interpretation of what the Protestant Christianity should be. Now, so now you've got a situation where there are Armenians initially in an old part of the empire that was in Eastern Asia Minor, Western Asia, more latterly referred to as Anadolu, which is a little bit inaccurate, but it's not the first inaccuracy that's come to be the reality. We also emphasize that the sultans lived fairly high off the hog and spent money they didn't have, sort of a familiar situation. And probably the most profligate spender was the Red Sultan, the Bloody Sultan, as he was referred to as Abdul Hamid II. Abdul Hamid was in many cases referred to as the symbol of the sick man of Europe. Turkey became referred to as the sick man because it really had a lot of difficulties, but I might also add quickly that the sick man ended up showing that it wasn't ready to expire yet. Structure, as we would now call it, to deliver aid to people who were suffering from whatever deprivation, whether brought about by massacre or whatever. I also drew attention to the fact that Clara Barton of our American Red Cross made a trip to the Ottoman Empire to give help to the Armenians that were survivors of the Hamidian massacres. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was not very anxious to let this happen, but ultimately, through persistence and pressure, she was let in, and there's a fair amount of documentation on that. I've talked about the archives and a lot of information in those archives, not only in America, but all over the place. France, Germany, what all. Your reference list, incidentally, if there's anyone here who did not get a list of references, can pick one up. These have been carefully selected from the perspective that many people can gain access without even going to a library. You can do it online. Now, the note on which I finished last time, if I remember correctly, was that the things could have been different if the reforms that had been intended for the provinces in the east that the Armenians inhabited predominantly had in fact come into play. The idea was to take the 6 or 7 provinces called vilayets and break them into 2 and put in charge of each of them a European. In this case, one was going to be a Norwegian.